Hello everyone, once again, welcome after the break. I assume that your stomachs are full. I hope you're not too sleepy. If you are, I'm going to send an electric shock. There's more to life than coding, says Marek Stój, our next presenter. You can easily tell by all the fancy stickers on his laptop that he's a computer geek, fascinated by how theoretical fundamentals of computer science influence the actual IT industry. With over 10 years of experience in various technologies, he's probably done it all, you name it. But for the purpose of this speak is maybe a bit less relevant, because recently he found a new purpose in life, a very noble one, is to bring self-awareness to fellow IT geeks, you. So let's hear it for Marek Stój and his 100% platform-independent speech, Sitting Considered Deadly.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. If I were to stand before you and take out a pack of smokes right this moment and light up a cigarette, you'd probably think I'm crazy, right? Well, for starters, you can't really smoke in here. And second, we all know, that smoking is bad for your health. But how do we know that? These days, it is common knowledge, but it wasn't always like this. You see, people didn't start smoking on a massive scale until after the First World War, and this was some years after the first automated cigarette manufacturing machine was invented. And it took decades before scientists and doctors started linking increasing incidence of lung cancer with smoking. In 1964, the Surgeon General of the United States published a report on smoking and health. And this report stated very clearly that smoking is deadly, right? Yet it wasn't until a couple more decades before this knowledge and this awareness became mainstream. So why am I telling you this? Because I think we have a great example of history repeating itself, and this time is about sitting. Because for some years now, some scientists have been saying that sitting can actually be just as harmful or even more harmful than smoking. So hello again, my name is Marek Stój, and as it's been mentioned, I've been a programmer for more than 10 years now, but that's not really important, as this talk won't be very technical. Instead, I'm standing before you to tell you how dangerous prolonged sitting can actually be. So let's dive right into it. How it is that sitting kills you. In 2014, a book was published written by Dr. James Levine, who happens to be a world-renowned expert on topics like obesity, sedentary behaviors, and negative effects of prolonged sitting. And this doctor is quite serious when he says that sitting is the new smoking. Now, going back to smoking for a little bit, in the year 2000, scientists and researchers, were looking for a way how to convey to the public that smoking is so dangerous, right? So they came up with these numbers, with these estimates, that, when you're a smoker, one cigarette might cost you 11 minutes of your life, and throughout the whole lifespan, it might mean 7 years lost compared to a non-smoker. Now, Dr. Levine, in his book, claims that 1 hour of sitting can cost us 2 hours of our life. So I was quite shocked when I read about it, and so I did some simple math, similar to the one they did with smoking, making some assumptions as to at what age we usually start our professional careers, at what age we usually retire, etc., and I arrived at this rough estimate of 15 years lost due to sitting. Let's keep that number in mind, as we shall revisit it soon enough. Now, the idea that sitting can actually be bad for your health might seem ridiculous to you. After all, it's a very natural thing to us. We do it all the time, actually. Right? So, but again, it wasn't always like this. like with smoking, if we take a look at the wider time horizon here, we'll see that our ancestors and our cousins evolved for millions of years as bipeds, that is, creatures moving on two legs in an upright position. So what was natural to them? Well, movement in an upright position. So of course they did sit, but it was, it wasn't the norm. It was more as a form of rest and relaxation after hours of exploration, hunting, and a bit later after hours of agricultural work. But what about modern times? So we can say that around 60 to 70 years ago, the so-called digital revolution started, right? And with it came the era of computers and office work. In 1960s and 70s, it was estimated that more than 50% of jobs, have at least a moderate amount of movement. An example might be a worker working at a production line in a factory, or a worker working at a printing press. Now, in the 21st century, it is now estimated that more than 80% of jobs, boil down to sitting on our buttocks all day long. And the trend continues. Now, the thing is that our jobs are not the only problem here. If we take an honest look at how our average day looks like, right? So we get up, we sit down to have our breakfast, we sit down in our cars, on a tram or on a bus. While we commute, then, of course, we sit in front of our computers. We get back, we sit down to have our dinner. For example, when we go to a doctor, what do we usually do? Well, we look around for a place to sit down. So researchers now estimate that on an average day, we spend 8 hours sleeping, 3 hours moving, and 13 hours sitting. It is that bad. So we might ask a question, where will that kind of a lifestyle lead us, right? So we could see what the future might look like in this awesome animated movie from 2007 or 2008, WALL-E. Highly recommended if you haven't watched it yet, right? So in this movie, we could see a picture of a society in which people are so obese and their muscles are so deteriorated that they can no longer move by themselves. So this might be our future. Now, I think that by now you're all wondering what it is exactly about sitting that is so harmful, so dangerous. So let's talk about this. It's been shown that prolonged sitting affects negatively both our bodies and our minds. Let's start with the body. In the year 2009, there was a paper published titled Sitting Time and Mortality from All Causes, Cardiovascular Disease and Cancer. So it summarized a 12-year-long prospective study of a cohort of 17,000 Canadians, ages 18 to 90. And what researchers shown is that there's a statistically significant correlation between how long a person spends on average sitting on a given day and their mortality, the general mortality, as well as mortality due to cardiovascular disease, which actually happens to be the #1 cause of death, according to the list published by World Health Organization. And the numbers that you see here, so it turned out that for a group of people who spend almost all their days sitting, and again, let's be honest, that's probably the majority of us here. So these people had 50% higher risk of dying compared to people who sat much less. Now, but this is only one example, right? This one study. However, there have been a lot of studies like these over the last 2 or 3 decades, and they linked prolonged sitting and sedentariness to a multitude of different health issues. Going back to Dr. Levine's book, so he calls it the alphabet of sitting illnesses. And the list is quite long. We won't be going over all of them. I just wanted to point out a few. So initially, when we think about prolonged sitting, we probably think about problems with the spine, some back pain, right? But that's just for starters. Prolonged sitting has also been linked to problems with the blood pressure, like hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and obesity, which are, you could say, a plague of our modern civilization. Heart attack, and various musculoskeletal disorders. The list goes on and on. But it's not everything. Because let us now think what sitting does to our brains, to our mental health. So again, I think that these days it is common knowledge that physical activity in general has a positive effect on our brains. So it's been shown that just taking a simple walk can actually improve our cognitive functions and creativity. And they knew that even in ancient times, like for example Aristotle, who founded this school, which was called a peripatetic school, because there was this habit of walking back and forth during lectures or during different disputes on philosophical and scientific matters. Right, so what happens to our mental health when we sit down? Well, for starters, we become grumpy. You probably know this phrase, a grumpy programmer or a grumpy IT support guy. So this might be the reason why such a phrase even exists. Because when we sit down, we become sad. We become anxious, angry, depressed even. And we definitely get stressed out. And Dr. Levine noticed, he observed, that the major problem with our world is that when we get stressed out, instead of simply getting up and going for a run, we sit down and we eat. So I hope that we can all agree that these so-called civilization diseases, a lot of them can actually be traced back to sedentariness. Of course, there are other factors at play here, like poor nutrition or lack of sleep. But again, I think we can agree that prolonged sitting is the major contributor to early deaths across the world. Now, then a natural question arises, right? Is there anything that we can do about it? Fortunately, the answer is yes. But before we get to it, I have some bad news. So, the first one is that even if you might think that these kind of problems won't concern you because you already lead this so-called active life, active lifestyle. So you regularly go to a gym, you go for a run, you play squash, whatever. It turns out that it's just not enough to negate all these negative effects of prolonged sitting if you're just active during your leisure time. And in order to find out that it is the case, let's go back to this Canadian study that I told you about. So what we see here, the numbers that you see on these diagrams are hazard ratios. So hazard ratio is a term from epidemiology and statistics. And in our context, we can look at it as a relative risk of dying. Right? So we have groups of people, depending on how much time they spent on average sitting throughout their days. And for example, the number of 1.5 means that this group had a 50% higher risk of dying. Right? Now, what is important here is that we have two diagrams, because one thing that the researchers did is they split people into two groups, inactive and active. They stratified by this property. So the active group, people in that group would declare that they regularly do some kind of physical exercise and sport. And if you take a closer look at the numbers for the inactive group and compare to the active group, you will see that these are higher. But the thing is that the trend is still there in the active group. So even if you're this so-called active person, but you spend almost all of your day sitting, these people still had 40% high risk of dying. There's also another myth that I wanted to debunk here. This has to do with these so-called ergonomic chairs, because they're also not a solution to the problem. You might have heard about this company, Herman Miller, which produces this quite famous chair, Aeron. It's famous because a lot of people are saying that this is the most comfortable chair in the world. Even if you haven't heard about it, there's a high chance that you saw it somewhere, like in a movie or TV series, because it seems that Herman Miller likes product placement just as much Apple does with its MacBooks. Now, the thing with ergonomic chairs is that they weren't really designed to be healthy. They were designed to be comfortable. And the problem with sitting is when we sit down, one of the major problems is that our core muscles, our abdominal muscles, which are supposed to stabilize our spine, they simply shut down, because our back is comfortably supported. And we all know that muscles which are not being used, they deteriorate with time. Now, the interesting thing here is that even Herman Miller admits this. So, in 2013, they published an article. It was titled "Sit, Stand, Move, and Repeat." And in this article, they said, I'll try to quote here, that the causal chain between prolonged sitting and potential health risks exists even if a person sits in a highly adjustable, comfortable chair. So you have to agree that something's up, because even a chair manufacturer says things like this. But this actually brings us closer to the solution. We just have to move more, but not only in our leisure time. We have to move more throughout the whole day. Now, you might think, okay, so maybe the employers should provide us, gyms in the office, and we should work out every single day or something, which by itself is not that bad idea. But this is not what I have in mind. In order to understand what I do have in mind, let's talk about this thing called need. So it's the thing that Dr. Levin and others researchers have been studying for quite a while now. So NEAT is an acronym that stands for Non-Exercise Activity Thermogenesis. So what is this thermogenesis? Simply speaking, it's a set of processes that happen within bodies of all warm-blooded animals, and that, of course, includes humans, which produces heat. And there are three basic types of this thermogenesis. So one is diet-induced. After we have a meal, our organism starts producing, using, and storing energy. The second type is physical exercise. When we physically exercise, we burn calories, of course. Now, but what we're interested here the most is the third type, which is the energy expenditure due to all other activities. What I mean by that, these are all trivial activities, like simply taking a walk with your dog, even cleaning up the room or doing the dishes. It is like this long tail on a metabolic rate, which, as Dr. Levin and others have shown, can actually add up to quite a substantial amount throughout the day. In other words, this is so-called natural and spontaneous movement. And it is very important. So I wanted to tell you about another thing, about this project Blue Zones. So a couple of years ago, Dan Buettner, together with National Geographic and National Institute on Aging, they set out to find places on Earth where people would live significantly longer than the rest of us. And a few years back, they did just that. So they identified 5 regions on Earth, like Sardinia in Italy or Okinawa Island in Japan, in which the number of so-called centenarians, that is people who got to live to be 100 years old or older, was significantly higher than the general population. And so they identified 9 common traits for these regions. They called them the Power 9. We won't be going over all of them, although I do recommend to read more about this particular project. Very interesting stuff. What I wanted to point out is at the very top of the pyramid, which is this natural movement. Because, you see, Dan, in his talks and in his books, he said and he wrote that he got to talk to a lot of these centenarians. I think there were more than 200 of them. And so he said that neither of these centenarians would declare that they do any physical exercise, at least not in our sense of the word. Instead, physical activity and movement was naturally interwoven into their daily lives. So think about it. So even though they didn't do any kind of physical exercise, they still got to live more than 10 years more than the rest of the population on average. So if you remember the number from the beginning of the presentation, I think I wasn't that far off. And Dr. Levin is definitely onto something here. So I hope that you now get the importance of this natural, so-called spontaneous movement. Right? We have to introduce more need into our lives. We have to move more. And we have to move more in our workplaces too, right? In other words, I think that the first step in the right direction here is to simply stand up, because the mere fact that we are standing, so our metabolism speeds up by about 30%. Our blood circulation improves. And our core muscles finally have something to do. They now have to stabilize our spine in order to maintain posture. When we stand, we also tend to fidget more, which also increases our need. And in some sense, standing is a gateway to other forms of movement. And what I wanted to stress out here is that the end goal for us is to introduce more movement. Standing up is the first step in the right direction. And yes, as you can see, I am talking about working in a standing position, height adjustable desks. You've all probably seen them. You might have even tried them. But I would bet not a lot of you work in a standing position on a regular basis. And I really, really encourage you to try and to stick to it. Now, if you have a problem that your employer doesn't provide such equipment in your office, hear out this story. So, some time ago, I worked for a company almost 100% of the time remotely. And so naturally, I wanted to create a nice workplace for myself at home. And so I went on the lookout for a height adjustable desk, a nice one, electrically adjustable. And as you can imagine, they were quite expensive. They still are. I was able to bring the cost down by ordering the parts separately and building it myself, but it was still quite expensive. It worked fine. However, after some time, I decided to change jobs, and I had to go back to an office. Remote work was no longer an option for me there. And so imagine my disappointment when I found out that there are no height adjustable desks there. Fortunately, I noticed that a couple of colleagues in an adjacent room somehow managed to work in a standing position. So it turned out that they implemented a very simple setup, simple yet brilliant, that I just had to copy. And my workplace at the time looked like this. It was a simple IKEA table with a shelf attached for the keyboard. Now, the funny thing here is that I like this setup much more than my, quite expensive setup at home. And I will tell you why. The problem with working in a standing position is that you simply won't be able to do that all day long while maintaining both your productivity and maintaining proper posture. Fortunately, this is not what researchers recommend. You don't have to stand all day long, especially at the beginning when you're just starting out with this. You should alternate these positions quite frequently, going from sitting to standing. And then increase the proportion in favor of standing, once your musculoskeletal system adapts to what it's been designed for in the first place. But from my experience, the problem with this alternating of the position was that I got distracted a lot. You probably know about this mental state of flow or being in the zone, where you're so focused on a task at hand, that you're very productive. You don't notice the flow of time. It's great to be in this state, but the problem with it is that it's very volatile. Just an innocent question from a colleague will get you out of it, and it will take some time to get back to it. So in my experience, this alternating of positions was quite distracting, but not with the IKEA setup, because I had two monitors, one at the bottom, one at the top. I had two keyboards attached and a wireless mouse, so it took almost no time whatsoever to alternate between positions, and it helped me a lot in order to start working in a standing position. Now, if you'd like to try this kind of solution yourself, let me repeat the parts that you would need. The IKEA table is called LAC, quite popular, very cheap. A bunch of shelf brackets. A shelf, mine was 80 by 30, bought in Castorama, a couple of screws, and you're good to go. Now, what is important here, that regardless of the solution, sit-stand solution you might want to try, is that you have to keep in mind that you have to, for starters, you have to set up your display so that its top edge is aligned with your eyesight. Now, the height at which you attach the keyboard, so that when you place hands on the keyboard, your arms should be bent at around 90 to 100 degrees. And lastly, when you do these kinds of try-ons, and later when you work in a standing position, you have to maintain a proper posture. You just have to stand correctly. But what does that mean? In order to answer that question, let me turn to another book. The title is Desk Bounds. There is a Polish edition, and the title is Skazany na biurko. I actually got really inspired by this book. It was a real eye-opener. It got me much more deeper into the topic of working in a standing position. And not only that, I highly, highly recommend that. The author of this book, Dr. Kelly Starrett, is a quite famous physiotherapist, a CrossFit trainer. So he works with world-renowned athletes, weightlifters, fighters, etc. And we won't be able to go over all the things that he mentions in the book, but he distills the problem with our modern world to these 3 points. One is that we just simply not move enough. When we do not do that properly. And we also don't maintain our bodies on a regular basis. I want to focus on the second point because, as Dr. Starrett says, movement starts with some kind of a position, and more often than not, it is from an upright standing position. So he spends quite a while on discussing how to stand properly. Now, so there is this bracing sequence. It's a series of simple steps that we do in order to position our body correctly. I could show it to you. I could tell you about it. But I think the better idea is if we try it hours if you try it yourself. So if you can just stand up for like 2 minutes, we'll go through the process together. All right. So there are four simple steps. The first one is that we place our feet parallel to each other, pointing forward. We squeeze our gluteal muscles, that is our buttocks. This resets the position of our pelvis, right? And now we imagine we try to screw our feet into the ground. By that we exert an external rotational force out of our hips, which further stabilizes our position. In the second step, in a second, we'll take a deep breath, ideally through a diaphragm. And while we exhale, we keep two things in mind. So one is that we keep our abdominal muscles tightened, and we make sure that our rib cage is positioned directly above the hips. Right? So let's take a breath. And keep the abdominal muscles tightened, along with the gluteal muscles. It doesn't have to be 100% of your power. 20% is just enough. Okay, in the third step, so we took care of our legs. Now, anatomically speaking, we'll do a very similar thing with our arms, right? So we exert a rotational force in our shoulders. So we rotate them backwards, and our palms point forward. And in the last step, we tilt our head a little backwards, right? The idea here is simple. We want to position our ears, shoulders, hips, ankles, and knees in one nice straight vertical line. We relax our forearms, our thumbs point forward, and that's it. That is the correct, anatomically speaking, position for the human body. All right, you can sit down now, if you want, of course, after you heard so much about the dangers of sitting. Yeah, this is the position that we should strive to maintain. Now, the bracing sequence concluded the second part of the talk. In the third part, I would like to talk about this topic from a different angle, maybe from a wider perspective. Because when you think about it, we've been hearing voices that lack of physical activity, lack of movement is bad for us, bad for our health, for a long time now. For example, more than 30 years after this report about smoking and health, there was another report by the Surgeon General of the United States, and this was about physical activity and health. It was in 1996. And even then, we could write statements like these. The families need to weave physical activity in the fabric of their daily lives. Or that health professionals need to encourage their patients to get out of their chairs. Now think about it. It was more than 20 years ago now. So tell me, why is it the case that our workplaces still look like these? Why the hell do we keep sitting ourselves to death? Well, I can give you a few reasons, or excuses, if you will. Well, for starters, there's the lack of awareness, lack of education, very similar to the problem with smoking, right? People are just not informed enough. Second, even if this awareness is there, and someone would like to, for example, try working in a standing position, there might be a problem of a lack of such equipment at the office. But the counter-argument to that would be, I just showed you that it is quite cheap, both figuratively and literally, to come up with your own do-it-yourself sit-stand workstation. And second, I once worked for a company with a bunch of offices in one city, more than 3,000 employees. All of those offices had height adjustable desks. And guess how many people actually use them to work in a standing position? Almost nobody. So that's also not the problem here. So I have this hypothesis. There's a third reason here, which is the fear. The fear of being an outsider, the fear of what others might think of you, the fear of being pointed at, laughed at, maybe even ridiculed. Of course, this is just a hypothesis based on my experience and talking to some friends. But I really believe that it's one of the major problems here. And I don't see any trivial solutions to that. We would need some kind of a cultural shift in order to overcome this problem. Fortunately, we could see how such a cultural shift might look like as far back as 2007. At that time, the owner of the company named Salo was kind of a fan of Dr. Levine's work. It was based in the US, and he reached out to Dr. Levine and asked him if he could help him design a new office for his employees in which they could test this neat thing, introduce more physical activity for the employees. And Dr. Levine agreed, and what followed was a 2 years long experiment in which people got to work in an environment like this. So not only everyone had a height adjustable desk at their disposal, they even had treadmills, right? So they could walk at a very, very slow pace while working at a computer or talking over a phone. They had collisionless paths, for walking meetings or also for calls, and simple things like that. Increased neat levels for all the employees. Dr. Levine even set up a full-blown laboratory within this office so that he could examine employees and measure things like weight, blood sugar, cholesterol, and things like that. Now, the results of this experiment were quite phenomenal. Just take a look at these benefits, some of them. So people lost some weight. They even gained some muscle tissue. All the health indicators that I mentioned improved, stabilized. Then what was important from the company perspective, they increased productivity, creativity, apparently even financial profits went up. But these are not things that struck me the most when I read about this. What struck me the most was this: increased happiness. Because, you see, not too long into the experiment, people started to become more active, not just at their workplace, but also at home. So suddenly they got this surge of energy, to actively spend time with their families, play with their kids, and energy to pursue their goals and dreams for which they didn't have energy before. And thanks to that, they were simply happier. So don't you think it's something worth fighting for? Dr. Levine definitely believed so. Just take a look at this quote from his book. At a personal, workplace, and national levels, a Airless Revolution, a national uprising of human movement, will improve productivity, generate revenue, better health, clean air, and enhance happiness. Now, the sad thing is that this experiment was more than 10 years ago now. And even though these kind of ideas are being implemented in some companies, especially in the US, but is by no means mainstream, right? In my opinion, this revolution that Dr. Levine mentions is just not happening fast enough. For my sake, your sake, as well as for the sake of our children's. So, when I was thinking about it, an idea for a project popped into my head. It's been running for quite a while now, and its name is Stand It Up. Let me explain. So I think that, I truly believe that Dr. Levine is right when he says that we are at the verge of revolution that will change the way we work, right? And I also think that the best chance to kickstart this revolution, to keep it going, is to start with our industry, IT. Why, you may ask? So I think we all know how currently the job market looks like for us. So it's very tough for employers to find experienced specialists. So they're willing to do quite a lot in order to attract talent and to retain it. Right? So hence these so-called benefits. Right? But I have an appeal to these employers. So instead of providing us chill-out rooms with the latest video game consoles, why don't you provide us mini gyms? Instead of providing us free sweet snacks and Coca-Cola, why don't you buy us height-adjustable desks? Or why don't you at least reimburse us for whatever do-it-yourself sit-stand solutions we come up with? I would even go as far as to say that we should work less, or of course for the same amount of money, let's say 7 instead of 8 hours, and we could utilize this 1 hour for things like some simple gymnastics, practicing yoga, mindfulness, what have you. And ideally, these kind of activities would be spread out throughout the day in order to keep the need levels high. Yes, you heard me right. I'm saying that we should sit less, work less, earn the same amount of money. In other words, I would argue that we need to stand up for ourselves. Because in the end, this is our health on the line here. And your employer doesn't care about your health, at least not in the long term. Because the brutal truth is that we are all expendable. So these new types of benefits that I think we should be asking for or demanding even should be the norm. Now, the thing is that the irony here is that these companies might not realize that they lose by not providing these benefits to us. They are paying this opportunity cost that's about not realizing the full potential of their workforce, just as the Salo experiment demonstrated. Okay? So a few words more about the Stand It Up project itself. So there are 3 main goals, right? So one is educating people, raising the awareness by putting some interesting stuff to read and watch on the website, of course, but I think also what is more important, by reaching out directly, exact thing that I'm doing right now, talking about me during meetups, at conferences, etc. Second goal, I would like Stand It Up to be able to facilitate this cultural shift, and I think that the way to do that is by reaching out to employers too. We need to inform and educate them as well. We need to show them that it doesn't have to be so expensive and that in the end it's a win-win situation. And thirdly, Stand It Up strives to unite our industry by providing a place either online or in real world, where we can meet, discuss our experiences and share our ideas on how we can introduce more physical activity into our workplaces. All right, so we are nearing the end of the presentation, and the last thing that I wanted to share with you is my motivation here. So why am I even doing all this? Why am I here? So I've been passionate about computers since I can remember. I think I was 7 or 8 years when I wrote my first program. It was in BASIC on a Commodore 64. And I think that even since then, I knew who I'd wanted to become, a programmer. And so I did become one. And with that came countless hours of coding, but not only at my job, no. Because for a geek like me, and probably for geeks like you, just around the corner, there's always a new shiny technology, new framework worth investigating, or an idea for a side project worth developing, right? So, of course, all these hours coding, I spent sitting. Add to that the fact that I was also a smoker for many, many years. And if you remember the numbers from the beginning of the presentation about the years lost due to sitting and smoking, I wonder how is it possible that I'm still standing before you. But anyway, over these 10 years of my professional career, I got to experience, let's call it nervous breakdowns, right? So total burn down, demotivation, depression even, 3 times. And fortunately, I was able to always dig out myself out of this, mostly due to the help of my close ones, for which I'm very grateful. But the problem was that soon after, I reverted back to the same behavioral patterns, and the problem was returning. So you might have heard this quote, supposedly by Einstein, that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Yeah, there's a paraphrase of this quote in Far Cry 3. Anyway. And so according to this definition, I was quite insane. Now, human body is a marvelous machine. Why? Because it can sustain years and years of abuse. But it will break eventually, no doubt about that. And so my body was giving me these signals that I was doing something wrong, but I just didn't listen. Fortunately, not until the 3rd breakdown, after which I think that finally a switch flipped in my head, and I finally understood that in order for me to continue down the career path, in order to continue doing what I love, which is coding, I have to do something about my life. So for starters, I need to quit smoking. I need to start moving more. And I also believe that it is equally important for me to quit sitting. All right, so I've opened up a little here, maybe a bit too much. But I told you a story about myself, but let me ask you, was it only my story? Because there's a parable that comes to mind here, and I recently found out that what I'm going to say is not necessarily true, but it fits nicely here. So the thing about the boiling frog, right? So apparently when you take a living frog and throw it into boiling water, it will just jump out of it and it will live. But if you put it into cold water and start to slowly heat it up, the frog won't notice the steadily increasing temperature, and it will get cooked to death. So let me leave you with a question that I think we should all be asking ourselves. Could it be that we are all such frogs too? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marek, for this inspiring talk. Are you also ready for some Q&As, or do we skip?
Sure.
Do we have questions? There is a question.
Yes. You asked the question, why do we not change these things while we know it's bad? I was wondering, children from an age of 6, we teach them to sit still for 40 hours a week, and that's the normal thing to do. You know, if there's been any research in standing up with children to teach them to keep standing while they grow up? Any long-term research?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. So the question was about children and whether there's any research on, introducing children to more working or playing and learning in a standing position. So actually, yes. And the problem is that it all starts when we are children, when we go to school. We just sit down, and that lasts for our. It goes into our adulthood. Now, Dr. Starrett's wife actually founded this organization, Stand Up Kids, standupkids.org, in which I believe they work non-profit, and they introduce height adjustable desks to schools. There's also another company here in Poland, based in Kraków. It's Elevodesk. They do a very similar thing in Poland. So they're doing some pilots, by funding this kind of desks to public schools. And so definitely Dr. Starrett in his book writes about this problem of children sitting down and children being forced to sit down.
Any further questions?
So I don't think we can give a... sorry, so the question was about whether there's a recommended proportion of sitting versus standing. So I don't believe there's any such recommended ratio. Well, actually, Dr. Starrett argues that you should stand all the time. Okay, but not everyone agrees with him. When you are starting out, as I mentioned before, you just won't be able to do that, and that's a problem. That was also a problem for me when I started out. I wanted to stand all the time. It's just not possible, and so you give up and you go back to sitting. So initially, when I learned about this, I alternated the positions after 10 or 15 minutes standing. I sat down, and because I was getting tired. And after a while, this was like 3, 4, 5 weeks, I was able to stand 2 hours, 3 hours at a time. So at my job, my proportion was like 60% in favor for standing, right? But someone said, and I hate that I can't remember who said that the best position for your body is the next one, right? So actually the end goal is to bring more movement. So you could try, alternating sitting and standing. It actually turns out that it doesn't have to be, standing like this all the time. You can take different proper standing positions or healthy positions. So you can vary it.
I have a question about kids. Sorry for personal about your kids. Because kids are not sitting only in school, but also at home when we help as a parents, when we help them to do homework. So how do you deal with this? Are your kids standing while doing homework, or what is a proportion? How you teach your kids?
So actually, I won't be able to answer this as I don't have kids. So I don't know. I could just guess that, for example, for Dr. Starrett, they really hate sitting, right? Because there's many biomechanical reasons why sitting is bad for you. It wrecks the whole body, basically. So they really are for standing and movement like as much as possible. So even for sitting, there are better and worse ways of sitting. So you can sit, using just a simple stool without any back support, and it will be better. Any physiotherapist will tell you that. Or you can sit, like maybe not in a lotus position, but with your legs crossed, and these are better positions for sitting because your back, unless you don't maintain your spine, but these are better positions because you don't have the support for your back. Yeah, but I guess I'm digressing a bit. Really can't answer about the kids thing.
Any further questions? I don't see any hands, so thank you very much. And I guess I wouldn't go too far. Those of you who are convinced by the speech are free to give a standing ovation.